Yes, that's right.
I moved house about 2 weeks ago, and when I went to print out my talk last night, I realised I didn't know where the printer was. So that's why I'm carrying it around on this thing. It's not that I like laptops very much, it's the only way I can think of actually doing it. So you need to do it. I don't know anything about Devon. I've got a couple of Devon references that I put in deliberately in the talk, but my interests are more broad than that. So my talk is very general, but hopefully I'll introduce you to some sources, some statistics, some questions that might interest you, and you will be able to apply to the own work that you're doing. When I started looking at the First World War, I didn't think there was much more to be said about women's work on the land. I thought it had probably already been done. And I was doing it for a chapter of a general broad book that I'm writing. And then, of course, as soon as you start getting into it, you realise there's so much more to be said and done. Hence the article and some of the work that I'm doing at the moment. So, let's... Is it?
Up and down.
Yeah. Oh.
Ah, yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay. So, assessing exactly how many women worked in agriculture during the First World War is actually a very difficult question to answer. And that's not unusual to the wartime itself, because one of the first questions you might like to ask yourself is, well, how many people worked in agriculture on the eve of the First World War? Okay, so we can gain a sense of whether the numbers, or how far the numbers increased during the war itself. That's a very difficult question to answer as well. If you look at these two pre-war sources of statistical information, you'll see they give very different estimates of how many women worked in agriculture. The 1908 Census of Production was an addition to the June annual return of that year. It's the first time they'd attempted to count labour. And it was a count of labour on all farms above 1 acre. And it distinguished between family and paid labour. It distinguished between temporarily employed and permanently employed labour. The 100,000 was divided between, it was about 35,000 employed permanently. No, sorry, 35,000 employed temporarily, and the rest were permanent workers on the land. As you can see, the 1911 census, the figure is much, much lower. The reason for that is the census was a tool for collecting information on full-time occupations. And hopefully, as you know, a lot of women's work on the land was of a casual or seasonal nature. So those two sources were doing very different things, which probably accounts for the very different figures. But it's a question that raises itself time and time again during the war as we... It's moving on here.
You've got a job.
Okay, so what happens during the first year of the war, between 1914 and 1915? As you'll see, particularly the July figure, which is when the seasonal peak of female labour on the land, there's actually a decline in the number of women working. These figures are collected by the Board of Trade. And they show, I think, the difficulties that farmers had at the beginning of the war in attracting and retaining female labour on the land. And the competition here really is the growth of competing war industries. Many of which were located in rural or semi-rural locations. Women could travel to them reasonably easily, and in the words of the Board of Trade itself, they were more highly paid and they were more attractive spheres of employment, particularly for young rural women. In contrast to agriculture, munitions and other industrial work benefited from set hours of pay and set hours of work, along with half holidays on a Saturday and no Sunday work as well, importantly. So you can see the previous figure showed us that between July 1914 and July 1915, the female workforce, according to the Board of Trade statistics, actually declined by about 16,000. Added to the attraction of alternative war industries.
The trouble is, it's now not changing on here, yet it's changing on there. So it's one more.
You've also, at the beginning of the war, got a degree of hostility from farmers and farm workers towards female labour on the land. Female labour to the Victorians and Edwardians was a disrespectful thing to do. It wasn't feminine, it was dirty outdoor work. And the Victorians had spent decades telling women they shouldn't work on the land. So it's interesting that by the time you get to the First World War and the state has to step in to attract women to land work, the war sort of turns that on its head. There was also a concern that if women workers were considered as substitute for male labour, then the army recruiters would take skilled male workers off the land. And of course there's a question over whether the women were actually physically able to do a lot of agricultural work. So there were a lot of issues in the first year of the war. Okay. The initial government response was to do very little. It's a very hesitant and delayed response. By 1915, you've got the interventions of Lord Selborne, who was then president of the Board of Agriculture, but they're very tentative. He says in 1915 that in the face of growing labour shortages, counties might like to form women's farm labour committees. But it was they left it very much up to individual counties. It's not until February 1916 that all counties were ordered by the government to set up an war agricultural committee. So by the summer of 1916, there were 63 women's war agricultural committees that had been set up. Some counties doubled up. This was England and Wales. So the women's war agricultural committees. They faced several challenges over their form and function. They operated under the Board of Agriculture, but they were not subject to its authority. Instead, they were essentially formed as subcommittees of the already existing war agricultural committees. Okay, they'd been in existence for around a year by this point. And the war agricultural committees were also made responsible for financing the women's committees. So there was a lot of toing and froing between the men. I'll call them the men's and women's committees because it's just easier for shorthand. Some of the men's committees refused to collaborate with the women's war ags. There's often delayed responses. There was some where the women's committees were said to be holding aloof from the whole process. As you can see, there's a report in 1916 where the initial problems that a lot of counties at the local level were experiencing. Shropshire was said to, have had particular difficulties, and as you can see from this, so was Devon. In Devon, there was said to be no cooperation with the Women's Committee, and they were working without any assistance and in spite of opposition from the WAC. And there were other problems in other counties. In Lincolnshire, there were no women's committees formed in 1916 for various reasons. So the Board of Agriculture doesn't really issue any direct rules or constitutions or functions for the women's committees. They have to muddle through and decide how they're going to be run themselves. It depended very much on the energy and efficiency of the individual women who stepped forward to run them. And it's interesting, I'm not sure whether any of the Devon Women's War Act Committee records survived.
Yes, they do. Wonderful ones. Lovely Calmady, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Not the minutes, though.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, no. I don't know.
Very few
records,
do.
yes.
Very few
Yeah.
do. The minutes survive.
There's lots of
But
newspaper
the
accounts.
newspapers are better than minutes
Yes,
in
yeah.
many ways.
It's interesting to look at who was running these committees and which level of rural society they're coming from.
Right, and in Devon it's Lady Mildmay.
There you go.
Well, she's
Yeah.
Mrs Mildmay at that point.
Right.
Her husband has not succeeded, and he's away fighting in France, Colonel Mildmay. So they're at the top now.
It sounds very typical. It was the women of the upper classes who sort of stepped forward into this volunteering role. Okay, the early work of the women's committees, so between 1916 and up to early 1917, their central role was to focus on increasing the number of local women who were employed on the land, so the resident rural women. All women were encouraged into war work, but the state sort of understood that it would mainly be the wives of agricultural labourers, the rural working class, who would step forward. And they did this through a registration system. So women who wanted to volunteer had to sign up to the registration system. Each county was mapped into discrete districts. There was district representatives in each of those, and there were thousands of village registrars appointed in 1916. So by 1916 they'd appointed over 1,000 district representatives and 4,000 village registrars. So it's a big operation that's wielded out. What the government are trying to do here is to elevate the working on the land. As I said, the Victorians were encouraging women not to work on the land. The state by 1916 is encouraging it as a part of the rhetoric of patriotism. It's patriotic war work for rural working class women to do their bit in agriculture, even if it's only on a part-time basis and they're doing it around their child labour and domestic responsibilities and so on. So it's seen as part of patriotic national service. I'm not sure what's next. So, how successful were they? In the middle of 1916, the women's committees were all asked to furnish the government with some numbers on how many women they had working at that point. Fortunately, not all of them did, but of those that did, the number comes out at just over 40,000. I was just checking what Devon sent in actually earlier, and we do have the figure. Devon sent in 2,574 women registered in August 1916. And that they talk about the attitudes of farmers. There's some reluctance amongst the local farmers here. The farmers are managing in general to carry on without the help of women, this report says. As you can see, that's much lower than the Board of Trade returns for 1916. So again, you're getting different views of how many women are actually working by the middle years of the war. So the sort of comparable Board of Trade figure actually puts the figure virtually double what the Women's Committee figures.